Good evening, everyone. My name is Ilan Alon, and today I will present to you my evaluations and observations of the Chinese market. It's a market with which I was involved since 1999, when I first went to Shanghai to teach in university over there. And since then, I think I've been to China about 20 or maybe 30 times. Over the last 7 years, I've also taken the chance to study the language, which is always a nice challenge for those of you who want to be challenged. And have written quite a few books, organized conferences in the Harvard Kennedy School, and quite a number of articles on the topic. So what I'd like to do is to give you a little bit of an introduction from my perspective, from a Western perspective, perhaps even from an American perspective on what is happening in China. But just so I get a kind of a sense of your background, I'd like to see a show of hands. How many of you have actually been to China? Can you raise your hand? Okay, so only a handful of you have actually been in China, which is good. You're going to believe everything I tell you. This is just a small collection of the many books that I've written on the topic. And the problem with China sometimes is that China evolves so fast that it's hard to keep track of the changes that are taking place in China. So today I'll give you a little bit of an introduction that hopefully will stimulate your thinking and get you to want to learn more about that, such an exciting market, and perhaps even to go and visit there one day, a place that I think once you go once, you want to continue going back. I'll start with a quiz because I'm a professor, and I just want to see what you know about China. And then I'll go and review the economic environment. I think many of you have heard about China. Every time you open the Business Week or the Wall Street Journal or your local Italian economic journal, you hear quite a lot about the Chinese market. In fact, I don't think you can even open a business journal today without at least one article about China. But I'm going to give you maybe a perspective that is a little bit more nuanced than that of the popular press. I will talk to you about institutionalism in China. And it's really, in order to understand the developmental path of any country, I think you have to really fully understand the institutional environment. And I'll give you a small introduction. And I will talk a little bit about the globalization of China. And China is now undergoing a kind of a radical transformation. If in the 1990s, late 1990s, China was a recipient, became a recipient of foreign direct investment. This position has changed in recent years that China is now going overseas. The latest figures that I saw is that China is now investing about $77 billion a year overseas. And a billion of anything is just a big number, right? Last year it was 60 billion. So just in the last year, the flows of investment have increased by $17 billion. It is expected that within a decade, the Chinese economy will export about between $500 billion to $1 trillion of capital. Not of goods and services and products, but of capital. So you probably will all be recipient of Chinese investment. And Chinese Italian companies, like other companies around the world, will be for sale, and the Chinese may be the ones that will be buying them. So I think it will be, even if you never go to China, you're going to have interaction with the Chinese because they're going to buy your real estate and they will buy your companies, and guess what? They may even employ you in the next 10 years. So a radical shift in the economic landscape of the entire world in ways that we haven't seen, in ways that we haven't expected. We have a kind of a declining empire, the United States of America, and a kind of a rising empire, China. And this kind of a shift only happens every several hundred years, and we happen to be very lucky to be part of this economic shift. And I'm going to make you think a little bit about what that may mean to us. And finally, I'm going to give you some tips, some points, some thoughts about key success factors, what it's like to do business in China. So if we begin, I'd like to know, well, what do we know about China? What do we really know about China? We know at least one thing, right? We know that China has a lot of people. And this is a picture of a train station. And this is not untypical of any train station in China, that you just see a sea of heads. And if you're a little bit taller than the average Italian population, you literally see it from that kind of panoramic overview. But this number of people, I think, is also misrepresenting to some extent the economic prowess on the one hand, and perhaps the meaningfulness of the individual in China. I thought I'll show you a quick clip that will demonstrate this. This is from an old movie. I think I can figure it out. This is a clip from a movie that talks about the number of people in China. It's called Half Moon Street, this particular movie. Take a look at this quick clip.
Now that really scares me. 900 million people breeding like rabbits.
You're wrong, Lady Newhouse.
What do you mean, I'm wrong?
There are over 1 billion now. That's official.
You're both wrong. There are only 2 people in China, and I know both of them.
2 people in China? I love it. Okay, if there are 2 people in China, how many are there in the world?
There are 5,000 people in the world. That's it, 5,000.
And I suppose, Mr. Van Arcady, that you've met them all.
5,000. That's all that counts. What about the starving millions?
A million isn't a number in any real sense.
There's murder in nature. Millions are dying right now. Starved, bombed in camps. Nobody gives a damn. You may deplore it, but it's a fact.
Those 5,000, who are they? How many of them are British?
45.
German?
60.
African?
None. And more Arabs than you might think, but they're all here in London.
I suppose the rest are American. And naturally, Mr. Van Arcady, you're one of the 5,000.
Bien entendu.
Tell me, how many are women?
Interested, aren't you?
Very.
Well, in order to know that, you have to watch the movie. See, the point is that I think that when we look at these big numbers, China has over 1.3 billion people today. You have to really think about what is the meaningfulness of this number. Well, back in the day, maybe even as early as 20 years ago, these billions of people meant very little because most of them were quite poor. But as China is getting rich, more of these 5,000 people mentioned in this movie are actually becoming Chinese. And it's probably now already more than 2. This movie was made some time ago. Today, perhaps we're talking about India in the same way. There's also over 1 billion people in India. Yet few of them are making the kind of changes, the kind of impact. And we don't speak about India in the same way that we speak about China. Well, why is that? It's partly because of the economy. So I thought I'll start with a kind of quiz. And this is a very simple quiz, one that is true-false. And I wanted to see how many of you are actually capable of answering. You have 50% chance of getting it right. So the first question is, Chinese people that released from collectivism focus hard on working hard and getting rich. How many of you think that's true? Raise your hand. Don't be afraid. Okay, raise it high so we can see it. Okay, most of you believe that that's in fact true, including ones that went to China, I see. Chinese workers are ambitious, mobilized, and engaged. How many of you think that that is true? Raise your hand. Okay, most of you agree with that. Good, good. Chinese consumers have a lot of money to spend. How many of you believe that? Raise your hand. Just a handful, and even they are just raising their hand this way. There's an endless hunger for household goods and all sort of goods that we sell. How many of you believe that? Raise your hand. Raise it high. Okay. So I think most of you, when I'm looking around, think that it's all true, right? The truth of the matter is that it's all false. So I think you can calculate your own grade. I won't have to do that. But why is it false? Is it false? Well, I actually took this from a Harvard Business Review article, this set of questions, where they actually debunk this kind of myths about the Chinese market. So when you look about working hard, in fact, most Chinese workers believe that they're underappreciated, that they're underpaid, and that they're working a little too hard for what it is that they're making. And they prefer to balance work and life and quality of life a little bit better. They have no interest in working 80 hours a week, and they have no interest in working in a factory for $2 a day. So these days of this kind of a pool of laborers who are willing to do anything for nothing for as long as you want to exploit, those days are to some extent coming to an end. And the Chinese consumers and the Chinese workers are looking around, and they're looking at the European lifestyle, and they're looking at the American lifestyle, and they're watching the videos from Hollywood, and they want to be part of this. They want to have the nice quality of life, like the one that you have. What about Chinese workers, ambitious, mobilized, and engaged? Well, as I said, they don't feel mobilized, they don't feel engaged, and they don't even trust their own products. Chinese prefer to buy Italian products than Chinese products. So while we go to the supermarkets and we see all these made in China products, be aware that at least in China, they go out of the way to buy non-Chinese products, because they actually have worries about the quality of Chinese products, particularly food products. I can't tell you how many friends from China I have who, when they come to America or Italy, they come back to China. They come to Italy with very little in their bags, and they come back with new clothes made in Italy, new shoes made in Italy, and perhaps even, believe it or not, food made in Italy. We probably have all heard about the melanin crisis, where many babies died as a result of tainted milk. Well, this is not unusual. This is happening every day. Food quality and food safety is a big issue over there. Even water. You cannot drink the water in China. In most parts of China, you must buy water separately. Not because you're looking for luxurious product or a branded water, but because the actual water that is in the faucets is unsafe to drink, and for most Westerners, unsafe to even brush their teeth in. Well, we talk about the GDP, and it's true that for those of you who don't know what GDP stands for, it's a gross domestic product, and it is the biggest measure, the broadest measure of economic development that we have. It measures everything that goes on in a given year in the economy. And today, what's really impressive is that China is now the second largest economy in the world, second only to the United States of America. And despite being second largest economy in the world, you have to remember that when you take 1 billion people and you multiply it times even a small number, you have a big number. So when we are looking at America, the American economy has about 300 million people. Yet the Chinese economy has over 1 billion people in an economy that is still smaller than that of America. So on average, the average consumer may only earn $9,100 a year. Now, even that number is exaggerated because income is not distributed equally. So it's not a bell curve, and everybody's in the middle. In fact, most people earn less than $9,100 a year. And this is already adjusted to purchasing power parity, by the way. So it already adjusts for the fact that things are cheaper in China. Most people earn less. 10% of the population earns $35,000 a year. 10% of the population earns about the same as Italian consumers. And this 10% is quite significant, because this 10% actually is 130 million people. 130 million people. 130 million people is the size of Japan. The size of Japan within China that is earning the same amount of money as Italy on average. But nevertheless, let's not forget that even if we take those 130 million out of the equation, we still have 800 to 900 million people that are living in dire poverty. And this is a picture of 50% of the population who are living in the rural side. So when we see pictures of Shanghai or Beijing or Guangzhou or one of the big cities or Hong Kong, oftentimes we forget that half of the population lives in rural areas. And note that sometimes they don't obey by the one-child policy, because over there it's harder to enforce some of the rules from Beijing as an example. So what about hunger for household goods? Well, you may expect that the Chinese consumers will go through the same type of evolution that we go through. That first they'll buy a broom, and after they buy a broom, they'll buy a vacuum cleaner and a carpet, and eventually they will buy one of those vacuum cleaners that cleans by itself the carpet, and perhaps a washing machine and a refrigerator and all these household goods. And of course, they do buy these household goods and they do manufacture these household goods, but if you look at the statistics more carefully, what they're really interested in is the Chinese are interested in high-tech products. What they really want is the Samsung Galaxy 4, the iPhone 5, the latest computer gadgets and the latest technologies. And they're willing to actually forego consumption of basic goods in order to be able to consume some of the high-tech products. So if you're in a business of high technology, you may have more potential in China than you might imagine. So if you look at the Apple stores in Shanghai, you wouldn't believe it. They're busier than the Apple store in New York City. There are enough people who are there willing to forego the other consumption of the other goods, the normal goods that you and I are taking for granted, and go directly to the latest and greatest technologies. So I guess what I'm trying to say to you is that our assumptions about economic development are based on our own evolution as a country, as an economy. And in this day of age, China is not developing in the same way that we develop. They're looking to leapfrog. They're looking to jump forward. They're looking to be, the best in the world. So let's talk a little bit about the economic environment. When we look at the economic environment in China, I can spew out all sort of numbers, and the numbers are quite impressive. But I don't think the numbers could be very telling if behind the numbers there isn't a kind of a closer visual understanding of what is happening. You may have heard of the concept called BRIC. BRIC stands for Brazil, Russia, India, and China. These are supposedly the 4 countries that will overcome the G of 7. The G of 7 include, by the way, Italy and France and Germany and UK and the US. Those are the largest developed economies in the world. Well, according to the Goldman Sachs report that was published in 2003, they've coined this term BRIC because they wanted to say that at least 4 of these developing economies, because they're growing so fast, by the year 2050, will be greater in size than the G of 7 combined. So 4 developing countries are going to be bigger than 7 developed countries. This is a kind of a revelation. This is a change that we've never seen. By the year 2050, China will be a larger economy than that of any other country in the world. In fact, this shows you China. This will be the US, and this will be India. And look at Japan. Japan currently the second biggest economy if you just take the GDP without purchasing power parity adjustments. Brazil, Russia, UK, Germany, France, and of course, Italy. So the Chinese economy, in fact, if you're looking at the latest projections, is due to overtake the American economy purchasing power parity within the next 5 years. Within the next 5 years, the world's leading economy is going to be the Chinese economy. Now think about what that means for a second. The Chinese economy, the leader of the world economy, will be an economy that is still a developing economy. This is perhaps unprecedented in the world's history, that the leading economy is not the most developed economy. Before, always the leading economy was the most developed economy. So there are going to be some changes to the institutional environments. The way we do business globally will be shaped by the leading economy. Not to mention that the strongest military power will also be led by the leading economy, because the leading economy can invest the most in military. And we're going to also see kind of a geopolitical shift in which China is going to be able to assert itself not only in the Asia-Pacific, which they already do, but around the world. A situation, again, that we are not accustomed to, and perhaps one that would lead to World War III if America and China will not be able to get along with one another. So this is the economic picture. But you know, the interesting thing is the Pew Research Center has done some research recently where they ask people around the world, where do you think China is? Will China replace the US as the world's leading economy? And the interesting thing is that if you ask Americans, 12% of them already think that China has replaced the US as the leading economy in the world. And they probably think that because China has 1.5 trillion US dollars in reserves, has over $3 trillion of reserves, whereas the US economy is, like the Italian economy, bankrupt. The only thing the US has is the print machine, so that's a nice thing, a nice feature to keep printing the money. But if you look at China, interestingly enough, which is also here, most Chinese don't believe that. Most Chinese don't believe that China is the leading economy in the world today. But most Chinese believe that China will overtake the US and probably shortly. And at that point, China has been very subdued. It's avoided, for example, conflict with Taiwan, conflict with Japan. At a point where China will overtake, I think there will be a little bit more aggressive in the international arena and be able to do a little bit more, make a little bit more changes in the international arena. This is a Pudong, is a kind of an area of Shanghai. And this is an area that went through a tremendous amount of development in the 1990s. And you may see some of the cranes. By the way, the crane is the national bird of China. I mean the building crane, not the crane, the bird. And you'll see cranes everywhere you go in China. And in this picture, you could see some of the development beginning in Pudong in the 1990s. I'm going to show you a picture of Pudong in 2005, okay? This is the area of Pudong, and this is the Shanghai TV Tower, Jinmao Tower, okay? This is Pudong in 2005. Well, has the development stopped since? No, not at all. In fact, it's really amazing. I'm going to show you Pudong in 2010, just 5 years later. And I need to get some more pictures of Pudong of 2015 soon. Because what is amazing about this is that at the time that these pictures were taken, most of the people lived in rural areas. Today, 50% of the people live in rural areas. About 10 years from now, only 20 or 30% of people. So you have this kind of urban sprawl. So many people are moving to cities that are already overpopulated. Shanghai alone has over 18 million people. In comparison to my home country, Israel, which has 5 million people, Israel has 1/3 the number of people that one city in China has. And just imagine that for a second. So this is happening across China, and there are now cities, complete cities, that are being built from scratch, that in the future will be the world's biggest cities, that at the moment have zero population. So this kind of geographical transformation, urban transformation, is probably unheard of in human history because of the technologies that we have, because of our ability to build. But it also means that China is now buying more steel and cement and raw materials than anybody else. So countries like Kazakhstan, countries like African countries are benefiting from this growth because Chinese companies have to go to these countries and obtain the kind of needed resources to fuel the urban development, to fuel the economic development But this is not only at the low tech and construction level. This right here, anybody knows what this is? This is the Maglev. It's the world's fastest train. Thing goes like 450 miles an hour, 450 kilometers an hour, sorry. It's a marvel. It's in Shanghai. It goes from the Pudong airport to the Pudong downtown. And it goes so fast that you pass by cars that are driving and they feel like they're standing still. This is actually a German technology. The interesting thing is, this German technology is at the moment not deployed in Germany, but yet it is deployed in China. So China is spending a tremendous amount of money on the latest technology, the most impressive technologies that we currently have. And what's happening with this transformation is that as these new buildings are being put up, these old buildings are being destroyed. And what that means is that there is a kind of a visual change in the cities of China, and perhaps a kind of a sad destruction of the history of these cities, because these buildings are making way to new buildings. And the problem is that some of the residents of people who are living in these buildings are evacuated without their consent, oftentimes. And given compensation, of course, but the compensation is usually not enough to be able to purchase an apartment in this building. So you have a kind of a push of the poorer people into the outskirts of the cities, a kind of social inequality that is being created by this very same development. And the irony is that while China is a communist country, in fact, China has the same type of income inequality that America has, one of the most capitalistic countries in the world. And that's really ironic, I think. Oh, of course, you see McDonald's everywhere you go. And companies like McDonald's, companies like KFC, companies are now earning more money in China than anywhere else in the world. And what that means is that they're going to make huge investments in China. They're going to double up and triple up on investments. So Italian companies are the same. They are funding the potential there. And Italian companies, instead of investing in Italy, are going to take the excess funds that they have and they're going to invest it in China. Because capital has no morality. Capital goes for the latest returns. Capital goes to where growth is. So if you ask executives in multinational companies, well, what do you think about China? They will tell you what Jeff Immelt, CEO of GE, says. Either you'll be the big investor in China or your biggest competitor will come from there. They will tell you what George Fisher said of Eastman Kodak, that if you want to be the leader in the world, you have to be a leader in China. They will tell you what Martin Pusht of Asia Pacific Volkswagen said, that for them it's not a risk. It's not how risky it is to invest in China, but rather how risky it is not to invest in China. Volkswagen, most successful market is the Chinese market. And it's still a growth market. More and more people want to drive cars in China. So I think this is probably some of the stuff you already knew. You knew there's a lot of people, right? You knew there's a big economy. You knew that they're growing. But maybe perhaps what you don't know and perhaps what you don't appreciate as much is the kind of institutional environment that exists in China. And when we're looking at the institutions in China, I think it's very important to understand that as China is growing and interacting more with the West, it is quite scary to Western leaders. It's quite scary to European Union leaders, and especially to American. You could see America really fears China and wonders and worries when China will take over as the leading economy. What will be the fate of the American economy? What will be the fate of the American worker? What will be the fate of global human rights? What will be the fate of our environment, the global environment? And this, of course, is a great concern for the Western leaders, including leaders of the European Union. And I think if you want to understand what the role of institutions, or what institutions' role is in economic development, you can think about the sports that you play. For those of us who play sports, you know that in sports we have rules. And in order for us to win, we have to obey the rules, right? So if you play soccer and you do something wrong, then there's a referee. And the referee takes out a yellow card and gives you a warning. And the second time, they take out a red card and they tell you that you have to stay out of the game because you're not following the rules. But who's refereeing China? Well, at the moment, nobody, because the global economy doesn't allow that to happen. We have a few institutions like the World Trade Organization that try to referee international trade. We have the International Monetary Fund, which tries to referee the exchanges of money around the world. But for the most part, China is not refereed. It's not controlled. It is a sovereign nation that can do whatever it wants. And what you have in China is a very interesting thing. You have a very good hardware, if we want to use a computer analogy, but we have a very bad software. So you may see in China these beautiful roads, and going into the village or going into the countryside, you know, they're making these investments in fixed assets, in buildings and roads. And part of that investment is because they want to employ a lot of people. You'll see these beautiful roads, and as they go, and these roads wind through the farmland, many farmers are seeing these roads and saying, what a wonderful place to dry the rice. What a wonderful place to put the vegetables. And of course, you could imagine a car going really fast, and there are sacks of rice in the middle of the road, and the kind of crashes that happen. So at the moment, you have, if you take the analogy of sports, a kind of a wild game where one side of the game, one team, is playing as they wish. And the other teams are abiding by some type of international rules. So in China today, you could buy a DVD for €1, even if it just came out. In fact, China has websites, which is very nice for the consumer, of course, websites where you could download the latest movie, any movie, watch it online, completely for free. Completely free. And unfortunately, they're not accessible from Italy. But in China, you can access them. And you can watch any movie, any show, in any language, for free. Well, of course, that's very nice to the consumer. There's a lot of consumer surplus that is being created by that. But of course, that means that it's not very good for the producers, particularly the ones that reside in Hollywood, right? They're not getting any of the benefits, right? So you have a kind of a situation where China is able to extort and expropriate intellectual property without any kind of control, without any kind of mechanism to govern the country, to govern intellectual property in this case. So you say, well, that's okay, who cares, you know? The folks in Hollywood anyways, they make too much money. And anyways, these Hollywood stars, they don't seem poor to me, so what's the problem? After all, the Chinese are poor, and Hollywood is rich. So this is just good old communism. Let's take the money from Hollywood and transfer it to the consumers in China. Well, that sounds good. You have to remember that intellectual property works as an incentive for people to invest in research and development. So Chinese companies themselves are fleeing China in order to invest in research and development. Chinese companies are investing in research and development, not in China, but in Europe and in America, in some of these places where they believe their intellectual property will be protected. So you have a kind of overinvestment in fixed investment, in infrastructure, in roads, in trains, in big buildings, but underinvestment in kind of the soft infrastructure, the ability to protect your innovation, for example, the ability to protect those assets that you have that require a strong legal environment. So this is a kind of a big issue for the development of rules. And a good one is traffic rules. And for those of you, for example, who've been to China, you find that traffic rules are quite chaotic. Oftentimes, it seems that everybody is, comes together to the intersection at the same time. Somehow, they weave in and out. But you could see that the number of accidents has grown significantly. Well, why is that? As I said, you have good roads. You even have good traffic lights, and you have a very good infrastructure. But what you don't have is people who know how to drive. In fact, you may see a man who is 40 years old in China, and you assume that in the West, that person will have 20 years of experience on the road. But in fact, that man may only have 2 years or 3 years of experience on the road. So he is more like a 19 or 20-year-old in his way of driving, in his skills of driving, as compared to the West. And what you have is perhaps traffic lights, but perhaps the traffic lights nobody abide with. Perhaps traffic lights that people just simply ignore. So this is a kind of a big problem, and this is probably true for the business environment as well. You have laws for intellectual property protection, but nobody abides them. Nobody abides by them. You have regulation for all sort of competitive practices, but people just do what they want. So as a result, you have, at least in the traffic example, quite a lot of accidents, and in the business environment, perhaps a point where the growth will slow down. And we think that this growth, the slowdown of growth, will happen perhaps in the next 5 years. Well, why will the growth go down? Well, part of the reason that the growth is probably going to go down is because you need to rely on good institutions. If you don't have good institutions, what you have remaining is relations. And you may have heard the term guanxi. Guanxi means relations in Chinese. And in Chinese, they say, if you don't have relations, you can't do business. Relations are quite important in order for you to be able to penetrate the market, to develop contacts with others, to develop trust, most importantly. Because you don't trust a stranger. You trust your brother and sister. You trust your father and mother. You trust your best friends, but you don't trust a stranger. So this particular guy, Xiaomin Li, is a colleague of mine from Old Dominion University, used to be a professor in Hong Kong. And he wrote quite extensively about this. He said, look, the problem of China, it's that it's not moving fast enough from being a relation-based economy to being a rule-based economy. If we want the road accidents to stop, we need to have people obeying the rules of the road. If we want the economy to continue to grow, we need to have people and businesses that respect the rules of business. For example, intellectual property rules. In the absence of doing that, what you have is a kind of a wild, wild west mentality. Let us make as much money as we can, as fast as we can, at whatever cost. Perhaps even at a cost of poisoning children with milk that is unfit for drinking. Why does that happen? Because there is a lot of people in China that want to make money fast and now. And they're not willing to wait 10 to 20 years to build the brand, to build the company, to invest in technology. So how long can you do that for? This is the question. And this is the question that Xiaomin Li asked. And I wanted to show you, he actually wrote the foreword to one of my books. He went to China and he was arrested. And the charge that he was arrested on is that he's a spy. I'm telling you, he's a professor. He's not a spy. He's somebody I know very well. I don't think he wants to work as a spy because he's got a pretty good career as a professor. So what did he write that makes people so upset in China, in the Chinese government? And I know this is hard to read, but I'm just going to read you a few sentences that are relevant to this. He said that when economies, including both markets and firms, expand from local to national to international in scope, relationship-based governance, the ability to relate to one another because of the relation that you have, becomes inefficient because the marginal cost of developing and maintaining relations. So that means that if you're trying to grow, initially you may hire your relatives and perhaps then you hire your friends, but at some point you have to hire people that you don't know And perhaps you have to hire people that live far away from where your headquarters is. And at that point, that growth can stall because you cannot trust the people who live far away because there's no rules. Remember, the rules that we have in the West took hundreds of years to develop. The court system that we have in the US was since Napoleonic time, in the EU, and particularly in Italy. Court system in the US was since the British time, when the British colonized America and created a common law with case history. And the way we solve legal disputes in America is by looking at previous cases. Now remember, China doesn't have a tradition of common law. China has a tradition of law of power. You know, if there is a fight between the emperor and the peasant is right, the emperor is wrong, who is going to get the results? Who's going to get the results they want? The emperor or the peasant? Okay? Obviously, in China, I think the answer is quite obvious. So, he wrote that transition is not easy or smooth, and it is disruptive and oftentimes confusing, chaotic. For example, in Beijing, you have the coexistence of a traffic police officer, which is basically relation-based, and automatic traffic lights, which is rule-based, both giving directions to traffic at the same time. And what's worse, they may give directions that are not consistent. He followed the police, as he found painfully, when he was arrested. And one of the features of this transition is that laws remain ink on paper. Laws are not uniformly and impartially and efficiently enforced. So those who have connections get one interpretation of the law, and those who don't have connections get another, yet totally different interpretation of the law. Perhaps this is the case in Italy with the case of Berlusconi, for example, as an example. But even in Italy, there is a kind of a move to tame Berlusconi and his relationships to the power players. So the problem is that when you see this as an external investor, you may come into the country and you say, wow, this looks like great laws. This looks like the stuff we have in the European Union. This looks like the stuff we have in America. This looks like the stuff we have in Taiwan. But the reality is, it looks like the stuff the laws that are in those countries. But those laws are seen as an opportunity to invest for the foreigners, but they're really, insiders in China see it as an opportunity to loot, an opportunity to rip off the foreigner. And this happens now every day. Few companies know how to make money in China. Even companies, quite large companies from Italy, have found painfully that doing business in China is very difficult, very costly, because of this thing. So, two scholars debated the context of whether China will rule the world or whether China will collapse. I know these two people very, very well. Those are two of my colleagues and friends, and both of them were invited to my university to give a talk. Martin Jacks talked about when China rules the world. And in his book, he makes a persuasive argument that China will rule the world, and that the 2008 recession, the Great Recession of 2008, in fact, is the turning point when China will show the rest of the world that it is the new world power. On the other hand, Gordon Chang wrote a very influential book called The Coming Collapse of China. And Gordon Chang has made a very persuasive argument that China will collapse in the next 10 years. He argues that a lot of this investment is useless investment, that the Chinese are making inroads going to nowhere, that you have a lot of people who are underdeveloped, a lot of people who are being used, exploited, and that this peasants that are not getting their rights, and that this is going to lead to a revolution which ultimately will make China collapse. And I think he makes a very good case with some very good empirical evidence that this, in fact, can happen. I wanted to show you a quick video of the future of China as seen by the latest American political establishment, and this was run by around the election times in America, and I think you will appreciate the video. It's a future.
为什么强大的国家都会走向灭亡呢？古希腊、罗马帝国、不列颠帝国、美国，因为他们都犯同样的错误，与原来使得他们成功的原则背道而驰。美国政府企图以庞大的开支和税收来摆脱严重的经济衰退，巨额的所谓刺激开支。 庞大的医疗改革，政府接管私有企业，债务累累。当然，我们是他们的大债主。现在他们都得给我们干活。
You can change the future. You have to. Join Citizens Against Government Waste to stop the spending that is bankrupting America.
So this is a real concern for, I think, people in the West. This was created by, of course, the American right-wing establishment, trying to scare people about China. But this growth of China as the leading economy, in my opinion, is not a certainty. I think things can happen in China. And if you study the history of China, you could see that China was already a very big nation. It was already the biggest economy in its history at different points in time, and that it collapsed afterwards. So the key to China's growth is going to be its ability to improve its governance, to provide a governance that is free of corruption, to provide a governance that gives people some basic human rights, that provides a government that gives even the people who are the lowest people in society an ability to make a future for themselves. In the absence of doing that, China's growth, China's dragon stature is actually perhaps all smoke and mirrors. And what I want to know is, in fact, if this, in fact, is important, then we have to look at the institutions of China. I think the thesis that I'm about to present to you is that if China is to be a world leader, it must have good institutions. It must be able to govern, select, and monitor and replace governments that are no good. It must be able to effectively formulate sound policies. It must respect the rights of citizens. In the absence of doing that, the growth can come to an end when there is a revolution, when people are organized. And you could see that even today in some very influential artists. For example, I don't know how many people know Weiwei. He's an influential artist in China that tries to kind of show the inequalities, to show the problems in the Chinese environment. The Chinese themselves are very fond of Ai Weiwei. But of course, like Xiaomin Li, he was arrested several times and he's been subdued by the Chinese government, which prefers to keep everything under wrap. The Chinese government prefers that there is no public debate over these kind of sensitive issues relating to their ability to govern and, in fact, their legitimacy to govern. So if you agree with this thesis, that institutions will lead to greatness, let us look at the institutions of China from the World Bank perspective. And let us see if indeed China has good institutions, or whether it has a long way to go. Let's take a look at a snapshot, a point in time, for at least 6 dimensions of the World Bank, including voice and accountability, the degree of democratization, political stability and the absence of violence, issues relating to risk, government effectiveness, the ability to implement laws, regulatory quality, the ability to have laws that are good for business and that are good for people, rule of law, the ability to govern the relationships not because of who you know, but what you know, and control over corruption, the ability to prevent people in power to steal the money and to expropriate the money from the poor and take it for themselves. For example, right now we have a huge problem in China. The Chinese are even keenly aware of it, of Chinese officials who take a lot of the money from the state coffers and ship it to Switzerland, and ship it to Canada, and ship it to America, and perhaps even send their family along so they can have a good life while they're stealing from the government and from the people. So how is China doing on all these? Well, I'm not going to tell you that this is my opinion. This is the World Bank data looking at these points. And this World Bank data divides the world into color schemes, where if you're deep green, you're doing quite well. And if you're deep red, you're doing badly. And everything in between is color-coded. So you could see, and by the way, you may want to also look at Italy just as a comparative sense, right? And this is China, and you could look at Russia as well. If you look at it carefully, you could see that at least in terms of voice and accountability, China is not doing very well. It doesn't provide with people the kind of strong protection that democracy provides. You cannot just say whatever you want. Okay, and if you compare that to US or Canada or Italy, where people have a kind of freedom and people have the right to choose their governments, it doesn't compare very well. Okay, what about the political stability? Well, despite the fact that China has a single government, the communist government, it has a lot of problems with the political system, and China is only around the 25th to 50th percentile of the world. Okay, and notice Italy here is about 50th to 70th percentile. It's quite better. What about the government effectiveness? 50th to 75th percentile. About the same as Italy. And regulatory quality? 25th to 50th percentile. Italy is, as you can see, is in the 50th to 75th percentile. This is not my data. This is the World Bank data. In terms of rule of law, it's not so good. It's the 25th to 50th percentile as compared to Italy here. You could see maybe is worse than the rest of the European countries, but still it's better than China. And what about corruption? That too is not very good, 25th to 50th percentile. Again, you could see Italy is better, although it's worse than the rest of Italy, it's better than China. So you see, if you believe that good governance would lead to sustainable growth, like I do, then you could see that China has problems. Now, you may argue, I think persuasively, and you may argue correctly, that it's not about the single point in time. It's about how things evolve over time. I mean, after all, for those of you who read The Jungle by Sinclair, you remember that even in the 1920s, the United States was going through a revolution in which workers were dying in factories. There was no OSHA. There was no protection for workers. People were getting, in the meat factories, falling into the grinder and getting grinded with the beef. And it was just a disaster. And over time, the U.S. started to develop better labor laws to protect labor. And that has helped the U.S. Emerge as a leading power eventually. So you can argue that maybe China is going through the same type of revolution or evolution that will, over time, as the country grows, will give more rights to the peasants, will lower the level of corruption, will give a better set of rules. But in fact, if we look at the data over time, and this is the data that I compiled from the World Bank, and I looked at it from 96 to 2008, a good stretch of period to look at. And where you could see 2008 is at the top and 96 is at the bottom. You could see that in relative term, voice and accountability is dismal and hasn't improved. Political stability hasn't improved. Government effectiveness hasn't really improved. Regulatory quality hasn't improved. Rule of law, not so good. And finally, control over corruption, even worse. So this is not exactly the story of a superpower. This is not exactly a story of a country that we hope will lead the rest of us towards a kind of a vision of a great China, of a country that will give us a kind of vision for the future, an ability to work within a kind of an international context that is fair, efficient, and that provides equal opportunity to its players. In fact, this is exactly why America is scared of China. This is exactly why the European Union is scared of China. And this is perhaps why Africa is not scared of China. And this is perhaps why Cuba and Venezuela and Iran like China. Because China says, I don't care. What, you want to kill 20,000 people to get the job done? Go for it. This is not our business. China is not going to get involved in other people's affairs. However, if you have oil, we would like to talk to you. This is, in fact, the case today. By the way, I'm saying all these things, and I don't want you to think that I'm kind of against China. In fact, I'm a friend of China, and I love China quite a lot, and I go to China quite a lot, and I spend many, many hours studying the language. My perspective is one that not only worries me as a scholar and as somebody who likes China, I think it worries even Chinese intellectuals. I think it worries a lot of people around the world that China is not making the kind of improvements that we hope it can make. And it's not to say that China will not make improvements. So in the next 10 years, China will have an opportunity to reform its government, to provide more accountability, and we're already seeing the seeds of that. For example, in China right now, in the village level, we have elections. Unheard of 10 years ago. But it's an experimental stage. You know, very, very little of that is actually happening. But I think China is even Chinese leaders are keenly aware that if they are going to rule the world, they will need to make some significant changes. And that's why every once in a while they hang a few officials who they catch stealing money. Every once in a while, the Chinese government will make agreements with the United States that they will tell them if any Chinese official is hiding money in US banks, for example. So they're keenly aware that they have a problem. They're just not sure how to solve this kind of a problem. In 1995, there was a discussion in the World Bank about who gets the money to clean the environment. And at that time, there was Lake Geneva that was being considered, where a few particles of dirt can be cleaned. Or it could have been Beijing. This is not a untypical picture of an afternoon in Beijing. How much can you grow? Well, how much more growth can we have at the expense of the environment? Well, maybe I can grow another 20%, maybe I can grow another 50%, but if you keep spewing the dirt into the air, well, even the officials have to breathe this air. Everybody has to breathe this air. And what you could see is that in the next few years, the degree of lung cancer and all sort of debilitating diseases is going to go up. And it's going to hurt the economic growth. It's going to hurt even the officials who have the money and the power cannot be immune from this kind of environment that is polluted. And their children, too, will have to grow in this kind of environment. So this is a major problem, and I think they're aware of it. Growth for the sake of growth is not enough. Growth has to be sustainable. And sustainability means respecting people, respecting the poor, respecting animals, respecting the environment. Well, about China's globalization. China has a very different model than the United States. We have a kind of a term for that we call Washington Consensus. Washington Consensus emerged after World War II, and at that time, United States companies were going particularly to Europe. Through the Marshall Plan, were able to build both Japan and Europe. And the idea was that America wants to build other countries that will be democracies, other countries that will have good governance. And America has done part of that in Germany and in the rest of Europe. And its idea was that free markets have a kind of a role to play in economic development, and that if you are to receive a loan from America, you must not disrespect human rights. And if you are going to have a kind of a project that helps the country, or that perhaps even takes resources from the countries, that those projects are going to utilize local labor and local ingredients in order to build the capacity. I personally was involved in capacity building projects from the United States in the case of franchising in Croatia. It's kind of connected to a class I'm currently teaching. Capacity building is very important to the European Union and to America because their desire is to make sure that those countries that they're working with become rich because they believe that if they become rich on an individual basis, if they become free, they will be trading with America and Europe and everybody will benefit. This is the Washington Consensus. Beijing Consensus is quite different. Its idea is that the most important is the government. The government leads the development of people and that it's okay if you kill a few people or hurt a few communities as long as the right outcome is achieved. And oftentimes when Chinese companies make investments in Africa or Latin America, they bring the entire labor force from China. By the way, in Italy too, there are Prato and other places in Italy where you have communities of textile manufacturers of made in Italy products that are in fact made by Chinese in Italy. This is the Chinese model of development. And of course, no transfer of knowledge. In fact, knowledge is power, and therefore you keep the knowledge. You don't share the knowledge. Very different model from the Washington Consensus. I'm not saying better or worse, I'm just saying different. And you judge for yourself what you think is better. And if you look at Chinese investment going abroad, I mentioned to you that it was a 60-something billion. Last year, it's 77 billion. So you have this huge outflow of capital. And if you look at the distribution of this capital, you note that a lot of that capital is going to the Arab world and sub-Saharan Africa. Sub-Saharan Africa has about $56 billion worth of Chinese capital. That's huge. In fact, nobody has invested in Africa as much as the Chinese are now. And the hope is that China will take Africa out of poverty. China always has seen Africa as a brother and sister countries, that they're in the same boat. Chairman Mao was very keen on developing relationship with the African leaders, for example. But note how small that is in the US. This is a country that has probably attracted more investment than any other country in the world, other than China, up until a few years ago. Very little bit of investment in the US. Relatively small investment in Europe, and a lot of it in Switzerland, probably for tax shelter reasons. Lots of investment in Australia, even though a small population, because a lot of these are investments in resource extraction. And the issue is that when I talk to the executives in state-owned enterprises in China, they say, we want to invest in America, it's just America doesn't want our investment. And I think you know why, for the reasons that I mentioned earlier. So why are they going abroad? They're going abroad partly because it's sometimes easier for Chinese companies to go abroad than to go inside China. They go out before they go in. So there is a kind of a term that developed, it's called round tripping. So a lot of Chinese capital goes to the Cayman Islands, goes to Hong Kong, goes to Switzerland, and then returns to China in the form of foreign direct investment. It seems like a long way to go just to kind of come back to China. But the reason is that they are now in China. China is more like the European Union than it is like America. You have provinces that speak different languages and eat different foods. And it is very difficult because they're run like fiefdoms. Each province has governor. Governors are each have their own agenda. And Beijing, of course, tries to control everyone. But the reality is that they each want to develop their own region, sometimes at the expense of another. So if you go to China, you will find that in Beijing, you will have a different set of cars that are on the roads than in Shanghai. Well, how is that possible? Because the Beijing protects their car company and Shanghai protects their car companies, and there is very little trade. So a lot of that happens through round tripping. And what Marshall Meyer from the Wharton School said is that the barriers to transaction costs are in fact increased so much when you go from one area of China to another that it's sometimes at this point the transaction costs equal to the ones going abroad. And at that point, the Chinese will go abroad before they go back, before they invest in their own country. If you ask the Chinese why they invest abroad, what they will tell you is that the number one reason is because of business potential. This is based on my own research. We talked to 46 of the largest state-owned enterprises in the Pudong Leadership Academy of the Communist Party. By the way, very interesting. The biggest companies doing investment abroad are, in fact, not private companies, but state-owned enterprises. The top 100 state-owned enterprises are doing 90% of the international investments abroad. So you could see that this is quite important, seeking new markets, seeking new natural resources, and part of the reason they go abroad is because government tells them to do so. And since government is the owner, they must obey the government. This particular theory was developed by John Child, and what he said is this. He said if China was to be successful going abroad, it has to really fully understand both the institutional environment and the legal environment, or the political stability of the country. So China now is a country that has a low institutional maturity because it doesn't have laws that have been around for a while and people recognize and respect. But it has a lot of political stability because there is a kind of a single government that controls everything. And on the other hand, United States is a country that has, okay, you could argue, but we could say that it has both political stability and institutional maturity from a business perspective. Italy probably belongs here. High institutional maturity, but low political stability. And what John Child, my colleague, said is that if a country from this part, from quadrant B, wants to invest in quadrant A, they're going to have a lot of problems because they don't know how to operate in this environment of institutional maturity. So they may try to bribe. Doesn't work very well, at least in America. They may try to work with the mayor's office instead of the law firms. And what you're going to see in the next year is an opportunity for Americans and Europeans to be able to extract a lot of the money that went to China back by opening up the markets, by giving them opportunity to do business. So this brings me to the last part of the presentation, which is doing business in China. What I want to share with you is just a few points that I think are relevant. China has what I call technological duality. You have a kind of the 19th century superimposed by the 21st century. You have both a primitive way of life alongside, like the peasant picture I showed you, alongside the most developed way of life. So in China, even in Shanghai, you will see a kind of a place where you could make long-distance phone calls, like we used to do, I guess, in the 1960s and 70s. Pay some money, and then you can make a phone call. And that is side by side with people with iPhones, and you know this guy, right? He plays basketball, advertising the latest technologies. It's a very peculiar situation where you have both the old and the new superimposed. These are some of this is a building in Beijing, the bridges, the nest. I mean, some of the most impressive technological and infrastructural projects that exist anywhere in the world. Actually, the guy who designed this bird nest actually is Weiwei. If you're interested in his story, I think you will be really amazed because after designing it, he was a very famous artist. He saw the damage that it caused. He saw that many people are being exploited and that the poor are being shoved aside because China wants to make a good image for the West and for the Olympics, and they were willing to do this, and he was very upset with that. And he made some comments against the Chinese government, and he became quite famous for it. But he could have had a very successful career. He decided to really, the most important thing is that to let people know the situation. After the Sichuan earthquake, he called the authorities and asked them how many people died. And they asked him, "Are you an American spy?" He said, "No, I just want to know how many people died and why. How many children died and why." And he went to Sichuan province. And he started going from school to school, and he asked people to join him. He asked the Chinese public, he said, join me. Let's find out who died and why they died. And he collected at least 5,500 names of children in Sichuan province who died in the earthquake. And he put them on the internet. And he then asked people to call in and to read those names, to engage people, and to engage the government in becoming more transparent so people will know, at least know what's happening. It turns out that much of the construction in the Sichuan area was what they call tofu construction. Construction that could not withstand even the smallest earthquake. Shoddy construction based on corruption and deals that were done between rich people trying to extort money from the government. Anyways, Ai Weiwei, remember that name. He does a lot of exhibitions in Europe. He's quite famous for that. In China, you have the most developed telecom market in the world. You have more cell phone users in China than any other country in the world. And Chinese are revolutionizing e-commerce. You now have programs on your cell phone that are emerging in China that you haven't even heard of. Skype-like technologies that are just unbelievable. And this is a huge opportunity for these high technology, not the low end, not the cheap labor, not the manufacturing of these products that you buy over here in Trieste in some of the Chinese shops, but rather the high-tech marvels that we all want, both in the West and in the East. But a lot of that is still happening while intellectual property is being taken and stolen. And in fact, some of the problem is that a lot of these factories that manufacture these fake products are actually government-owned factories. So the government is tasked with cutting down on intellectual property violation, but yet they're the ones violating the same intellectual properties that they're asked to crack down against, you see? So it's a kind of untenable situation. How can you ask the government, how are you going to ask the cat to guard the milk? It's a very difficult situation. How can you ask the government to stop the intellectual property violations when they're the ones violating the intellectual property? Okay, this you know is KFC. And this is Yonghe Dawang, right? It's a local Chinese KFC, kind of. They kind of look the same, right? He looks like the colonel. This is a Honda CR-V. It's a Japanese car, and this is the Laibo SR-V. You can see those are very similar looking vehicles. This is the Chevy Spark, an American vehicle. And this is the Chery QQ, Chinese vehicle. So it's pretty much for sure that if you go to China, you can expect that whatever technologies you're bringing in, whatever marvels you're bringing in, will be copied within a year, maybe less. If it's really good, even less. I worked with a number of Israeli companies, really interesting because Israeli companies are quite good in technology. And one of them, they brought the multi-lock. I don't know if you know this very famous locking device for the car and for the house. And within a year, all their technologies were stolen and they were out of the market because they couldn't compete with the local producers. Another company was making routers, and another Israeli company. And they didn't even know, but their own routers were being developed in China by the Chinese. And the only reason they found out is they opened some of these routers and they found that one of the secret pieces that they have is not theirs. So they sued. And in fact, the Chinese company sued them too for intellectual property protection. And the Chinese company won and they lost. Okay, so, well, whose rules are you enforcing exactly? Well, Nike has the swoosh, and Li Ning has the swoosh too. Very similar. Adidas has impossible is nothing, and Li Ning has anything is possible. Okay, very similar slogans, very similar swooshes, and you should expect for that to happen when you go to China. I now recently just saw some Starbucks imitations. Pretty good, actually. With the same green signage, with the same good coffee. Actually, a little bit even better because it fits the Chinese market a little more with a little bit of Chinese sweets Looks just like Starbucks, exactly like Starbucks, but not exactly it. This is the same example, so you can get a sense of this. So how do you do business in China? By the way, how do you deal with this intellectual property rules? There's ways to deal with everything, okay? We're pretty smart in business, and we figure out how to deal with anything. One way to do that, remember the Volkswagen said, our risk is not to be in China, but not to be in China, right? So there's clever devices to do that, and I don't have the time to go into how companies can protect their intellectual properties, but there is ways to protect yourself and to do business and to make money in China. And certainly companies like Volkswagen have figured it out. Others have not. So actually, if you want to go to China to do business, there's 3 points of entry. Most people go to Shanghai, and that's probably the most popular place now. It used to be that Hong Kong was the most popular place to go, and because Hong Kong was the door in. Today, Hong Kong is the door out. And Shanghai is the door in. And if you're doing business with the government or with government entities, then you need to go to Beijing. These are the 3 points of entry to China. Anything else is suboptimal at this point. More and more people are going to Chongqing and Chengdu, and this is kind of becoming more popular, but it's still going to be these 3 cities are the majority of the foreign investment. So I figured I'll give you the 10 commandments of doing business in China. You have to remember them, okay? You remember the regular 10 commandments? You remember thou shalt not kill, respect your mama, papa, whatever, the rest of them, all right? These you have to remember. The other 10 commandments you can forget, okay? I'm just joking. I'm in a Catholic country. All right. In China, everything is possible. This is a really positive thing. However, nothing is easy. In China, patience is the essence of success. Expect things to be slow. Expect things to be frustrating. The answer yes is not necessarily an indication of agreement or confirmation. Because Chinese don't say no. In fact, the word no doesn't purely exist in the Chinese language. Just an interesting note. You don't understand China means they disagree with you. By the way, maybe means no, just so you know. No doesn't exist, but maybe, let's see, or let's think about it, that's no, okay? Provisional regulation means they can change the rules anytime they want, even retroactively. So the American Chamber of Commerce, the biggest chamber of commerce in the world, is set up illegally. And in fact, they just fixed it, I think, this year or last year. But for a while, they couldn't even pay with a credit card. You have to pay cash for the American Chamber of Commerce. Basically, no problem means big problem. Meiwenti is not Meiwenti, okay? Signing a contract means the beginning of the real negotiation. When you're optimistic, think about rule number 2. Nothing is easy. And when you're discouraged, think about rule number 1. Everything is possible. So, in order to succeed in China, think about the Olympics. Think about these gymnasts. You have to be patient. You have to be persistent. And you have to be focused. And if you are, I think a lot of people have made a lot of money in China. Some of them are my friends. And there is ways to do that. It's just going to be different than making money in Italy. And just be aware of that it requires different strategies. And as you recall, I was telling you the Jeff Immelt example, that he said that you have to be the biggest investor, or the biggest investor will come from China. But the multinational companies, in fact, are like 800-pound gorillas. They come to China, and they're seen as the kind of the evil in some ways. In fact, anytime there's a problem, the Chinese government always likes to blame the multinational companies for some of their own problems. But you see, what you don't realize is the Chinese, the American multinationals and the foreign the big multinationals, not the Italians. The Italians are not so big, actually. But the big multinationals from Germany and from America and from the UK, they understand they need to adapt to the local conditions. So they put a little red lipstick on the gorilla to make it more attractive. But what they don't realize is that, in fact, the Chinese don't like gorillas. the Chinese like pandas. So if you want to do business in China, learn how to be a panda, not a gorilla. That's a kind of the need for adaptation for the local market. And if you want to be successful in China, you have to build your relationships like the Lupu Bridge was built in Shanghai. You have to bring the skills and assets and knowledge from home, and you have to find partners in China who can bridge that gap for you, people who perhaps know the Italian culture and the Italian market and are able to make the connections that will allow you to be successful and connect the points. I took this first quote from a book that I read by a woman who talked about how to be successful in the 21st century. And she said that in order for you to figure out where your talents and the world's meet, that's how you will figure out your destiny. This is, I think, a very important sentence. I actually suggest that you reflect on this sentence for a moment. Destiny, it's a big word. Your destiny comes from your ability to find out what is the skill set that you have, not that Italy needs, not that Trieste needs, but that the world needs. That's where you'll find, your fortune. And in the 21st century, you need to find out where those strengths fit with the China's ascendancy. And that's where you'll find your fortune and ability to make money. I thought I'll finish with a Tao Te Ching quote. And this quote is a very old one from China, from Lao Tzu. And he said, Dao ke Dao fei chang Dao, Ming ke Ming fei chang Ming, which means, actually I don't know exactly what it means. It doesn't make sense even in English, right? The way that can be expressed is the everlasting way. The names that can be named are the changeless names. This is such a great, sentence, only if I know what it means. Well, what it means is, Taoism is a kind of a philosophical underpinning of Chinese culture. Taoism suggests that at the end you have to flow like a river. And I think that this is a good analogy for China because China is changing so fast, is developing so rapidly, that it's like a river. That by the time I present to you these kind of set of propositions and ideas and thoughts about China, China is changing. Every year I go to China, sometimes twice a year I go to China. And every year I'm just amazed, I'm shocked how much it changed since last year. Even people within China can't fully grasp the changes. And if you have foreign students telling you they know about China, by the time they describe it, if they've been here 2-3 years in this university already, they don't know China. China has changed. China changes very, very quickly. And I think that's something that you have to understand and maybe discount some of the things that I said earlier because they're at least a year old, some of them even older. So I thought I'll finish here with a picture of the Great Wall and a place that you need to go if you ever go to Beijing. Thank you very much.